On the 9th of April, 1694, in Bloomsbury Square in London, a Scotsman named John Law killed a man with a single thrust of his sword. He was 23. He was arrested. He was tried at the Old Bailey. He was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death. He did not hang. His sentence was reduced to a fine on the argument that the killing was manslaughter, not murder. The dead man's family fought that reduction and had Law imprisoned while they appealed. So he escaped. He got out of the King's Bench prison and he fled the country. 22 years later, that same man, a convicted murderer, a fugitive, a professional gambler who could not safely return to Britain, was invited to rebuild the financial system of France. He accepted, and for a period of roughly 18 months, John Law had more control over the French economy than any single person before or since. This is the story of what he built, what it did, and the extraordinary fact that at the very same moment on the other side of the Channel, England was building almost exactly the same thing, without either country copying the other. Two nations, one idea. Both collapsed within a year. To understand 1720, you have to understand that neither France nor Britain set out to build a bubble. Both set out to solve a problem. And the problem was real. The problem was war debt. Louis XIV had spent more than 5 decades on the throne, and a great deal of that time at war. When he died in 1715, he left France effectively insolvent. The interest payments on the royal debt consumed an enormous share of what the state took in. The country was not poor. France was the largest economy in Europe. It was simply that its government owed more than it could service. Britain had the same disease from the same cause. Decades of war with France had left the British state carrying tens of millions of pounds of debt, much of it in the form of annuities that could not simply be paid off, because the holders had a contractual right to keep receiving them. Now hold both of those facts in your head, because what follows is the important part. Two governments, working in 2 different countries with 2 different systems, arrived independently at the same solution. The solution was this: take the national debt and convert it into shares of a trading company. Instead of the state owing money to thousands of individual creditors at a fixed rate of interest, those creditors would hand in their debt and receive company stock. The state's obligation would shrink. The creditors would hold something that could rise in value, and the company, in theory, would generate real profits from real trade to justify the whole arrangement. On paper, it is elegant. It converts a fixed liability into a variable one and gives everybody a reason to want it to work. That last part is the trap, but nobody could see it yet, in either country. And the men proposing it were not frauds. They were solving a genuine problem with a genuine idea. This is stage 1. It always looks like this. John Law believed something that was, in 1716, close to heresy. He believed that money did not need to be metal. The prevailing view was that a currency was worth what the gold or silver in it was worth. Law thought this was a constraint that served nobody, that an economy limited by how much metal happened to be in the country would always underperform what it was actually capable of. Paper money, backed by the state and by productive assets, could expand to fit the real economy rather than the other way round. Modern economists largely think he was right about this. He was 2 centuries early, and the way he tried to prove it destroyed him. But the underlying idea is now simply how money works. In 1716, he founded the Banque Générale with the right to issue notes. In 1717, he founded a trading company, the Compagnie d'Occident, with exclusive rights to develop French territory in the Mississippi Valley of North America. Then he began to assemble the tobacco monopoly, the trade with China, the trade with the East Indies, the right to mint France's coins, the right to collect France's taxes. By 1719, the company had been renamed the Compagnie des Indes, though almost everybody called it the Mississippi Company, and it held a monopoly over French colonial trade. In January of that year, his bank was taken over by the state and became the Banque Royale, with its notes guaranteed by the crown. One man now controlled France's currency, France's foreign trade, France's tax collection, and France's mint. Here is the mechanism, and here is the flaw in it. Investors bought shares in the Mississippi Company. They could pay using notes from the Banque Royale. And when demand for shares outran the supply of notes, The Banque Royale issued more notes. Read that again, because it is the whole thing. The bank was printing the money that was buying the shares of the company that owned the bank. Law structured the share issues to compound the pressure deliberately. The original 1717 shares were called the mères, the mothers. A second issue in June 1719 became the filles, the daughters. A third in July, the petites filles. And each new issue could only be bought by people who already held the previous one. If you wanted in, you had to buy your way up the ladder. Demand was engineered into the structure. It worked spectacularly. Shares that began around 500 livres were trading, by the end of 1719, at something in the region of 10,000. Some accounts put the peak considerably higher. Whichever figure you take, the rise across a single year is somewhere between a 20-fold and a 30-fold increase in the price of a company whose actual trading operations in Louisiana were, at that point, close to non-existent. Fortunes appeared. Servants and shopkeepers bought in. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, writing about this period, notes that it produced the first recorded use of a particular word: millionaire. The word did not exist before people needed it. Across the Channel, the South Sea Company had been founded in 1711 by Robert Harley and a financier named John Blunt. Its stated purpose was trade with Spanish South America. That trade never materialized in any meaningful way. Spain kept its colonies effectively closed, and the company's commercial operations were, throughout its existence, close to irrelevant. What it actually became was a mechanism for holding government debt. It had already done smaller conversions in 1715 and 1719. And at the end of 1719, Blunt and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, proposed something far larger. The South Sea Company would take on essentially all of Britain's remaining unconsolidated national debt, a figure of roughly £31.5 million, in exchange for its own stock. The Bank of England put in a competing bid. There was a bidding war for the right to absorb the national debt, which is an odd sentence to write and was an odd thing to happen. The South Sea Company won. The Commons accepted its proposal in February 1720, and it received royal assent in April. It won partly on terms and partly by other means. The subsequent parliamentary inquiry found that stock had been allocated to ministers, members of parliament and courtiers, in some cases without any money changing hands at all. Fictitious entries in the company's own books, recording purchases that had never been made. Aislabie himself received £20,000 of stock. The share price in January 1720 was around £128. By the end of March, it had passed 300. By the end of May, 550. By June, it was near 900, and in August, it passed 1,000. And the company did the same thing Law had done, arriving at it independently. It began lending people the money to buy its own shares. 2 schemes, 2 countries, 2 sets of men who did not coordinate. The same fatal loop in both. By early 1720, both countries were in the phase where the price stops being connected to anything. In Paris, trading concentrated in the Rue Quincampoix, a narrow street that became, for a period, one of the busiest financial markets in the world. Rooms along it let for extraordinary sums simply because of the address. In London, the South Sea boom spawned imitators. Dozens of new joint stock companies were floated on the enthusiasm alone, chasing money that was looking for somewhere to go. And in June 1720, Parliament passed the Bubble Act. You will often see this described as Parliament's response to the crash. It was not. The Act was passed in June, months before the collapse, and it did not restrain the South Sea Company at all. It required new joint stock companies to obtain a royal charter, which is to say, it suppressed the South Sea Company's competitors. Far from cooling the market, it removed the alternatives. South Sea stock rose again on the news. The same month, John Blunt was made a baronet for what was officially described as his extraordinary services in raising public credit to a height not known before. If you watched the episode on the anatomy of bubbles, you have met one of the participants already. Isaac Newton sold his South Sea holding in the spring of 1720 at a substantial profit, having decided the thing would end badly. Then he watched it keep climbing, and later that year, close to the top, he bought back in. He was not ruined. He died a wealthy man. But the best modern reconstruction of his accounts puts his losses above £20,000, and on his worst purchases he lost as much as 77%. At the time he was master of the Royal Mint. France went first. In January 1720, some holders began doing the obvious thing, converting their paper gains into gold, which exposed the arithmetic underneath the system. The Banque Royale had issued notes far beyond the metallic money that existed in the entire country. Law's response was to make it harder to leave. He limited payments in gold. He restricted how much coin a person could legally hold. He restricted the manufacture of gold and silver objects. In March, he instructed the bank to buy shares at a fixed floor price, using newly printed notes, which is to say, he responded to a collapse in confidence by printing more of the thing people had lost confidence in. Then, in May 1720, he issued a decree halving the face value of the banknotes, intending a controlled deflation. It was not controlled. It was an official announcement that the currency was worth half what the state had said it was worth the day before. The system came apart across the second half of 1720. On the 28th of December, John Law fled France. The company was placed in receivership the following April. He died in Venice in 1729, poor. England followed within weeks. The mechanism was the installment plan. People had bought stock on a small down payment with the balance due later, and when the payments came due in August, they had to find real money. The only way to find it was to sell. Selling lowered the price, which meant more people needed to sell. By September, the share price was back near where it had started the year. Parliament convened a committee of secrecy, which reported in early 1721, and what it found was fraud on a considerable scale. Fictitious stock, ministers bought, the company's own books falsified. The consequences were unusually real for the era. John Aislabie, Chancellor of the Exchequer, resigned in January 1721, was found guilty by the Commons of what they called the most notorious, dangerous and infamous corruption, was expelled from Parliament and was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The estates of the company's directors were confiscated by Act of Parliament, valued at just over £2 million, of which around 350,000 was returned to them to live on. The remainder went to the people who had lost. James Craggs the Younger, Secretary of State, died of smallpox during the investigation. His father died the following month. Lord Stanhope collapsed in Parliament while defending the government's conduct and died the next day. Robert Walpole managed the aftermath, protected several of his colleagues from investigation, and emerged from it as the most powerful politician in Britain. The man generally counted as its first Prime Minister. Contemporaries gave him a nickname for the protection he provided. They called him the Screen. So, two countries, one idea, no coordination between them. Both began with a real problem. Both chose a mechanism that was defensible on paper. Both found that the mechanism required ever more money to sustain it. Both responded to the first signs of trouble by supporting the price rather than letting it fall. And both discovered that a scheme which depends on continuous new buying has no stable state. It can rise or it can collapse, and there is no third option. Neither country thought it was doing what the other was doing. The French believed the flaw in England was the absence of a proper state bank. The English believed the flaw in France was the paper money. Each was looking directly at its own reflection and describing someone else. The ledger has been open for one episode. Tulip mania in 1637 cost less than most people think, a genuine mania with a modest bill, and we said so at the time rather than inflating it. 1720 is not that. Two national economies, two currencies, an entire generation's savings in two countries, and a debt so large that part of the British obligation created in its aftermath was still on the books and still being paid until the 21st century. By one GDP share estimate, the debt Britain alone restructured through the South Sea Company, £31.5 million, was equivalent to roughly half of the country's entire economic output that year. Carried forward at that same share of the British economy today, that's on the order of £1.5 trillion. France's side of the ledger isn't included here. Its economy of the time isn't sourced closely enough to convert on the same basis without guessing. Next, we stay in Britain, and we find out what happens when a country decides it has learned its lesson. The full ledger, established 1637.